Hey everyone, welcome back to my devlog. Today I want to talk to you about the difficulties of learning as a beginner in game development. As someone who has gone through this journey myself and is still going through it, I know just how challenging it can be, but I also know it's not impossible. The first and perhaps most significant challenge for a beginner is simply getting started. With so many different tools and technologies available, it can be overwhelming to figure out where to begin. Do you start with programming, game engines, or art and design? And once you've made that decision, there are countless resources available, which can make it difficult to choose which ones are the most effective. Personally, in the previous video, I told you guys that you should figure out what game engine you want to do. I was contemplating between Unity and Unreal, and from the brief research that I did, I decided for Unity for these couple of reasons. Number one, it's beginner friendly. The UI in the interface is made so that it's not too complicated, and it's got a lower skill ceiling. What I mean by that is that even though Unreal Engine has more photorealistic graphics and has more capabilities, Unity performs just as well, albeit it lacks a few functions, but it is much more streamlined, and a majority of people seems to use Unity, so that means there's just a bigger plethora of resources available since the community is so much bigger. Number two, I don't know if this is true, you have to do your own research yourself. From a video that I watched, it sounds like Unreal Engine takes a 5% cut of any game that you're going to publish, and Unity doesn't do that. And in the video, it says that 5% might not sound like a lot, but when you factor in how publishers take a cut, the people that's going to be working with you are going to take a cut, it all adds up. So even though 5% doesn't sound like a big deal, I decided that, well, if Unity's free and it's not going to ask for a cut of my profit, which I highly doubt will get to that anytime soon, I decided for the long term that Unity is probably better. So I decided to use Unity, and I started off with their basic tutorials. I started off with making my own 2D platformer, albeit this was just to familiarize myself with just how the Unity UI and hub works. I've never touched Unity before, so being able to fidget around in a guided tutorial on how to use Unity with the assets already preloaded was quite enjoyable. It's been a very long time since I've actually decided to learn something that wasn't mentally taxing. I've done ballroom dancing, and I can tell you that any technical skill that's physical is a lot easier to learn than stuff like this, where it's all theory, knowledge with a slight sense of technicality. Now, the first platformer that I did was very simple, very basic. It was already preloaded in. So as I was fidgeting with the UIs and everything, I was able to have a better understanding of how Unity works. But the thing that was very annoying and a brief glimpse of what Unity Engine is like is that I came across the issue where I was able to fidget with the game a little bit, and when it came time to publishing it and, putting it on basically a Flash game website, it wouldn't let me publish it because it kept saying there was HTML error. I could not understand why. A friend who was a Twitch viewer of mine told me that apparently when you're trying to save the folder on desktop, it creates a lot of issues. You should just save it on the default pathway that it had set up for you. So I went back, deleted the pathway from downloading it to my desktop to downloading it in my C drive. I did that and tried to publish it again, but once again, it just came out with the error HTML. At that point, I just decided, screw it, I'm just going to try to figure this out. So I just hit cancel and hit publish again, and lo and behold, it works. I don't know why, but it just worked. Eventually, I was able to get it so that I was able to open up that game that I had fidgeted with on the browser, and I was able to play with it, which was pretty cool. But I decided that I should still continue to do more tutorials, so the next one that I decided to go into was a create your own RPG. Same thing again, I open up the pre-loaded assets, and it basically made me play around with it a little bit. But one thing that gave me a little aha moment was this moment here. It made me create a house with a roof. Now, I made the house, I made the roof, but the game tells you that you want to be able to make the roof fade when the character enters into the house, which I did. But the weird thing was, as I was experimenting with it, I realized that when my character entered into the house, it had to go in to the house very deep before the roof started to fade, which was counterintuitive because, when you enter into the house, the roof should fade right away, not halfway into the house. But what was very smart about the tutorial was it had already factored that in, and in the next step, it talked about collision boxes, where it was basically saying that the roof, before I had expanded it to make it fit the size of my house, had a predetermined collision box, and that collision box had stayed the same. So when my character entered into the house, it wasn't hitting the collision box, and therefore it didn't trigger the script to fade the roof. So what I had to do was I had to go back into it, expand the collision box to make it so it was the size of the house. And after going back into the game and putting my character through the house, then I realized it was like, oh, apparently it was doing exactly as it was supposed to be intended to with the collision box. It's just that once you expanded the sprite, you also had to expand the collision box so that the script registers with it. Anyways, I thought it was really cool, and it was like a little amazing aha moment, and it felt amazing. Don't get me wrong. It's been a long time since I've learned something like this, so I was like, wow, this is amazing. But the funny thing was that throughout the beginning, I found that it was a challenge because I felt like I was learning so slow. It was very easy to get frustrated when the progress is slow, especially when, you see other experienced developers creating amazing things seamlessly, effortlessly. And I took a step back and really told myself that it's important to remember that they likely had to overcome the same challenges that I was facing when I'm starting out. It can also be challenging to stay motivated when progress is slow, especially if you're working on a project that's more ambitious than your current skill level. This is where I think setting realistic goals and breaking down larger projects into smaller, more manageable tasks can be more helpful. Celebrating small successes like this along the way, I think, can be very helpful to just keep your motivation up. One of the biggest challenges I faced as a beginner was just dealing with the constant feeling of being overwhelmed. There's so much to learn, and it can feel like an impossible task to master it all. One way to deal with this is to just focus on one thing at a time and not worry about mastering everything at once. It's important to remember that even experienced developers are still learning, and it's perfectly okay to take things at your own pace. Another difficulty beginners often face is the lack of feedback. Without feedback, it can be hard to know if you're on the right track. This can make it challenging to improve. So joining online communities, sharing your work, and seeking feedback from more experienced developers can be a huge help in this regard, which is the next thing I'm probably going to do is join a community. But let's make something first before I do that. Finally, it's important to recognize that learning game development is not just about mastering technical skills. It's also about learning how to think critically and creatively and how to approach problem solving in a new, innovative ways. It's a skill set that takes time to develop, but once you do, it can be incredibly valuable in all areas of life. I was watching this YouTube channel. I believe it was called GMKT. It's basically a guy who talks about his dev journey on making a game about magnets. That's his whole spiel. But what was interesting was that as I watched his 5th or 6th video, he was talking about how he had to manually create puzzles, and it was getting very tedious because every time he had a new level, he had to create a new set of mechanics. Basically, he was talking about how he had his gimmick, and every time he had a new level, he had to create his gimmick again. But what he didn't realize was that Unity is a game engine that's developed in a way to make you make games. So all he had to do was write a few pieces of code and make it so that his gimmick was a game object, a prefab, if that makes sense, which is a new term I learned, which is cool. Basically, a prefab, or from what I understand, is that it's a game object within, or it's an object in your game that has predetermined properties that you can adjust and change, and it's just a set item. And how he was doing it before was inefficient, but the moment he made that connection where he could just turn each of those gimmicks that he was making for every single level into a game object that he can adjust at will, it made his life so much easier, and it just made coding so much easier, which is something that I am completely oblivious to. But what I took away was that, all right, so there are ways to streamline this, make it simple, and just not make it super complicated, and just streamline things, which is great. So in conclusion, learning game development as a beginner can be challenging, but it's also incredibly rewarding. Just like me, the moment I figured out about collision boxes with the roof, I was like, whoa, wow, I am learning, which is great. Honestly, by setting realistic goals, staying motivated, and seeking feedback from others, it's possible to overcome difficulties and become a skilled game developer. There are plenty of people out there who are willing to help, I'm sure. I just got to go out there and find those people. Remember, take things at your own pace. Don't be too hard on yourself if progress is slow. Keep learning, keep creating, and you'll be surprised at what you can achieve. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys in the next devlog.